What's up guys, Asian here again with another theory crafting video, and today we're going to be discussing which enchant you should be using on your front bar as a magicka DPS. This has kind of been a source of contention for some people, so today we're just going to kind of figure out which enchant is actually going to be best for you. Now we are doing this on a magsorc, so these results are going to be very specific to the magsorc, and we are doing them on a Breton. But if you are an Ultimate Sorc, which is kind of the most popular race class combination, because Ultimate has a flat 4% increase across the board to all elemental damage taken. Basically what that means is the results that we find here with the Breton can be applied to the Ultimate as well, just because their elemental damage, since it's flat 4 across the board, 4% increase across the board, it is a linear increase, so we can take our results from today and extrapolate those onto the high elf. However, if you are a dark elf, you can't exactly do that because dark elves get 7% additional flame damage but only 2% to shock and frost. So that needs to be a completely separate test, just so we don't confuse any of those variables out, because while you do get some additional damage from your shock glyph, you still also get some damage onto your flame glyph. The other thing too is, because we are using a magsorc, magsorcs get 5% extra damage to shock damage, so our flame glyph is actually getting nothing right now as a Breton magsorc. So if you're a Dunmer magsorc, you have that 2% from your Dunmer passive as well as the 5% from your magsorc, and then you have 7% from your flame glyph. So there's just a bunch of different things that are happening there. So just for simplicity's sake, these results are only for magicka sorcerers, either Ultimate or Breton. So we're going to quickly discuss kind of the arguments for both sides. So we're going to be starting off with the flame damage enchant today. And then we're going to be doing a second part with the shock damage enchant. So weapon enchants can proc their respective elemental status effect. Flame damage can proc burning. Shock damage can proc concussed, which is also known as minor vulnerability. And frost damage can proc chilled, which is also known as minor maim in terms of debuffs. So minor maim decreases the damage dealt by enemies by 15%, so enemies hit you 15% less. It's not necessarily going to be a linear increase depending on other debuffs that they have, but you can say 15%. Minor vulnerability or concussed increases the damage you deal to the enemy by 8%. Again, it's not necessarily going to be linear because there are a bunch of different multipliers in effect in terms of buffs and debuffs. But theoretically, it's a max 8% increase to all damage. And then burning is just a dot. It deals flame damage and it has 4 ticks over 4 seconds. All of these status effects last for 4 seconds. So the burning does the most damage, which is kind of the argument for the flame damage enchant, that the burning DPS increases substantially and that pushes it ahead of the shock damage enchant. The other argument for flame damage is that if you're using Lambris and you're a magsorc, your only source of fire damage is going to be either light attacks if you're using an infernal front bar, or force pulse if you're doing a force pulse build. If you're using a heavy attack build, chances are you don't have any fire damage whatsoever. So that's kind of where the argument comes from. Since you want additional flame damage to proc the fire proc of the Lambris, adding in that extra flame damage plus the extra chances of burning increases the DPS of the Lambris fire proc, which pushes it ahead of shock damage combined with that extra burning DPS. Now the argument for the shock damage glyph is, in order to set enemies concussed, we'll go over to Blockade of Storms real quick. Here. So in order for enemies to be set off balance, they need to be concussed. So shock damage glyphs have a 20% chance of applying concussed. Compare that to the 10% chance from Force Pulse. Liquid Lightning and Blockade of Storms both have a 1% chance of applying concussed. Your light attacks and heavy attacks actually have 0% chance of applying concussed. So shock damage enchants are going to be your primary source of concussed if you're not using an Asylum Staff. Because the Asylum Staffs have a guaranteed concussed application every third or second force pulse, depending on which staff you're using. So because of that, a lot of people, the argument for shock damage glyphs is you have higher concussed uptime, which leads to higher off-balance uptime. So the shock damage glyph ends up boosting your DPS more than the increase due to burning and the extra Lambris procs gives you. And the addendum to that is also it boosts your group DPS. So the burning doesn't affect anybody else in the group. The concuss and the off balance affects everybody else, every other DPS in the group that has that exploiter passive, which is going to be most DPS classes, if not all DPS classes, are going to be using that exploiter passive in the blue CP trees. So that's kind of the argument for frost, or for shock, I should say. Frost damage enchants, nobody ever uses them. I rarely see people use them. You might see them on some niche warden build, but for the most part, frost damage is kind of a nobody really uses it because it's pretty much useless. Minor maim is normally applied by the tank when they use heroic slash, so that's kind of why frost damage enchants you don't really see them ever. So we're just gonna test everything out today. We're gonna be starting off with the fire damage enchant and then swap over to a shock damage enchant. We are doing a non-pet build. That's just is easier for me. I don't have to necessarily concentrate on keeping my pet pulse up. We are going to be using 2-piece Lambris, 5-piece Julianos, and 4-piece Moondancer with 2 spell damage and 1 magic regen glyph on our jewelry, and infused front bar lightning staff, and Nern VMA lightning staff back bar with a weapon damage enchant. I already have parses for all of them, so we're just going to add these 2 parses to the end of them. And then at the end we're going to do some magic math in order to see what the flame damage enchant would actually hit in a scenario where you are actually getting similar, or I should say identical, off balance and minor vulnerability uptime compared to the shock damage glyph. Basically, if you're in a group where you have a lot of magicka DPS and they're all running shock glyphs, that's the kind of scenario that we're going to be mathing out at the end of this video. So that was our flame damage glyph. Parse. Now we're going to get back our ultimate and swap the flame damage glyph out for a shock glyph. I'm going to do the parse again. Take a look at our combat metrics and see whether or not the claims from both sides of the argument hold up. And then we'll just do a comparison between the 2 parses, averages I should say, of all the parses, and then we'll do some math to figure out how much damage the flame damage glyph would actually deal if it had the same off balance and minor vulnerability uptime as a shock damage parse. Now there's also been discussion of absorbed magicka glyphs being very useful just due to the extra sustain that they get. That is not something that I have tested yet. It's going to require a different style of testing. Compared to the 3 million dummy, I'm going to have to do these tests on at the very least, a 6 million dummy in order to see if there is a difference in DPS using an absorb magicka glyph or not. And that's just because the 3 million dummy, well, it only has 3 million health, so any sort of sustain issues that we have aren't really going to necessarily be very apparent. And that was our shock damage parse. Both of these parses are actually on the lower end of things. Most of these two parses just weren't that great, so we might not actually include them in the averages here. So our shock damage pulled 32.9, and our fire did 32.5. So just looking at this, it seems like fire does pull less than shock, but if we take a look at our debuffs out, we can see here on the shock we have 80% uptime on off balance and 54 uptime on minor vulnerability. If we swap over to our fire enchant, we only have 35% uptime on off balance and 28% uptime on minor vulnerability. So that shock damage, proccing concussed, or minor vulnerability is probably pushing it ahead, but by how much? That's kind of what we're going to figure out with our math. So we're going to swap over now to our spreadsheet, so you guys can see the parses that I've already done. These are the parses I've done already. We have 6 on each side. These are the averages. These are the standard deviations. So we can see here that the shock damage glyph is pulling out ahead by about 1k DPS. There is a lot of variation in the shock damage glyph parses. You can see that there we have an almost 1.1k difference there. In terms of standard deviation, so our lowest was 33.3 and our highest was 35.8. So that is something to keep in mind. Some of these 33 parses are probably more accurate compared to the 35.8, but that's kind of why we make an average, so we can kind of try to mitigate the wild variation thereof. So shock damage seems to be pulling ahead by 3.3%. However, like I pointed out there, we do have differences in minor vulnerability uptime and off-balance uptime between the two parses. So we're going to basically do a little bit of math and try to figure out how much would the flame damage glyph actually parse if we had identical off-balance and minor vulnerability uptime. So this is just an estimate. This is not necessarily going to be the parse you would actually get. This is just the theoretical maximum that you would be able to get on a parse with those off-balance and minor vulnerability uptimes being equal. So what we do is basically we take the difference between these two and basically multiply the difference as a decimal, as a percentage, by the percentage increase that off-balance and minor vulnerability will give us. So if we take, for example, off-balance, we have 80 on the shock glyph, minus 35 on the flame glyph. That gives us a difference of 45%. Convert that to a decimal, you have 0.45. Now the exploiter passive gives us 0.1% extra damage, 10% extra damage. So you multiply that 0.45 by 0.1, and that will give you the percentage DPS that you're getting from the shock parse that you aren't getting on the flame parse. So we get 4.5% extra DPS is coming from that off-balance uptime. So you do the exact same thing for minor vulnerability, except instead of 0.1 we're using 0.08 because minor vulnerability is increases damage dealt by 8%. So we do 54 minus 28, which gives us 26%. Multiply that by 0.08, and you get about 2.1%. So now we add up those two numbers together, so 0.045 plus the 0.0208. That gives us a 6.58%, and now we multiply that, we add 1 to that, and then we basically it's now 1.0658, and we multiply that by the flame damage parse, flame enchant parse. So we do 32,514 multiplied by 1.0658, and we get our theoretical maximum parse that we would get if we had the identical off balance and minor vulnerability uptime. So swap over here to our calculator. I'll paste it there. So this is kind of what I did in the background while I was talking. So this is our minor vulnerability. So we did the 80 minus 35, we got 45%. Convert that to a decimal, multiply that by 0.1 to account for the exploiter passive. And then we did the exact same thing with minor vulnerability, multiplied it by 0.8 for the 8%. Took these two numbers, added them together. We added 1 to them, which is what you see right here. And then we multiply that by the flame damage parse, and this would be the theoretical maximum that you would be able to parse with the flame glyph. So 34,653. So we can see that is higher than the shock damage parse that we did, shock damage enchant parse. So in a fully optimized rage group where you have a lot of magicka DPS, let's say 4 or 5 magicka DPS, running shock glyphs, if your healers are also running shock glyphs on their front bar, or not front bar, or any bar, or really any of their weapons, and you're getting that high off balance uptime, then it might be worth 1 or 2, not all of them obviously, but 1 or 2 of the magicka DPS swapping to a flame damage glyph instead of in shock damage glyph, just because you are getting some extra single target DPS there. That's probably coming from, if we swap over to back to ESO, take a look here at our fire damage glyph. We did 1434 and 786 on burning, 613 on Lambris. Charged 1476, but burning and Lambris did far less, so that's kind of where the DPS difference is coming from. So the flame damage glyphs, that side of the argument does have some points there, that Lambris and burning are doing more damage, and your flame damage enchant is dealing probably more or less the same amount of DPS as your shock damage glyph. On Historic, it's probably going to end up doing a little bit more. These parses, like I said, were a little bit on the low side. These are kind of anomalies, the 2 standard deviations away from the mean kind of parses. So that's something to keep in mind. But again, the shock damage glyphs, that party still has their very valuable argument that you need to have high minor vulnerability uptime in order to keep your off balance uptime high. So in a raid, if you have 4 magicka DPS, it might be worth 1 or 2 swapping to flame damage glyphs if your goal is to start maximizing your DPS. It's going to change and it's going to vary based on each group setup, so I do recommend going through and testing it out yourselves on like a 25 million dummy. Just start taking out shock glyphs, putting in flame glyphs, and kind of see what your off-balance uptime looks like and if there is a substantial change. And once you see that substantial change, like your DPS starts to drop, that's how you know, that's how many flame and shock glyphs that you're able to maintain with your group. It will take a lot of time to figure that out, but if you are going for progression runs, if you want to maximize your DPS, if you want to go for score runs, it's not a bad idea to do that. So that's it for this video. I know it was a little bit long, and very, very dense, I should say. But I think this is a topic well worth exploring. So I hope you found it informative. I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.